Before rock music took over the world, two bands were already battling for the crown. Beatles and the Rolling Stones. One stood for melody, innovation, and a clean-cut image, while the other embodied rebellion, raw energy, and danger. The media framed it as a war, good boys versus bad boys, and fans everywhere chose sides. But this rivalry wasn't built on hate. It pushed both bands to become greater. As the Beatles redefined music with bold experimentation, the Stones answered with grit and attitude that gave rock its edge. In the end, they didn't just compete. They created an era that changed music forever. At number 10, Blur versus Oasis, the Battle of Britpop. This wasn't just a band rivalry, this was a cultural war. In the mid-1990s, the UK was split in two. On one side stood Blur, art school, ironic, and sharply observant. On the other, Oasis, loud, unapologetic, and rooted in working-class attitude. The conflict reached its peak in 1995, when both bands released singles on the exact same day, Country House versus Roll With It. The British media turned it into a national event. It wasn't just about charts anymore, it was about identity. Who truly represented modern Britain? Blur won the chart battle that week, but Oasis won the war that followed, with What's the Story, Morning Glory, and anthems like Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in Anger. Oasis exploded globally, becoming one of the biggest bands of the decade. Still, the real winner was Britpop itself. This rivalry pushed both bands to sharpen their sound, define their image, and elevate British music back to worldwide dominance. Because in the end, this wasn't just competition. It was the spark that turned a genre into a movement. Number 9, Ray Davies versus Dave Davies, The Kinks.
Can't sail my yacht. He's taken everything.
Before the fame fractured them in public, the war had already begun at home. Ray and Dave Davies weren't just bandmates, they were brothers locked in a volatile, lifelong rivalry. Clashing personalities, creative control, and deep-rooted resentment turned every rehearsal into a battleground. Arguments didn't stay verbal for long. There were moments of real physical confrontation, including infamous on-stage fights that forced shows to stop mid-performance. But inside that chaos, something groundbreaking was taking shape. Dave Davies, frustrated and searching for a heavier sound, famously slashed the speaker cone of his amplifier to create the raw, distorted tone that would define You Really Got Me. That sound, aggressive, jagged, and unapologetically loud, didn't just give the Kinks a hit. It helped lay the foundation for hard rock and eventually heavy metal. Meanwhile, Ray Davies pushed in the opposite direction, toward melody, storytelling, and sharp social commentary. This creative tension between chaos and control became the band's identity. Each song felt like a compromise, or a collision. Yet the cost was constant instability. Tours were disrupted, relationships strained, and at times, the band seemed on the brink of collapse. And still, the music endured. Because in the case of the Kinks, their rivalry wasn't a weakness. It was the engine that drove them to create something louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. At number 8, Black Sabbath versus Ozzy Osbourne. The band that helped create heavy metal, torn apart by its own internal chaos. This is the story of Black Sabbath versus their iconic frontman, Ozzy Osbourne. In the early 1970s, Black Sabbath changed music forever. Dark riffs, haunting atmosphere, and a crushing sound gave birth to an entirely new genre. At the center of it all was Ozzy, whose eerie, unmistakable voice became the band's identity. But behind the success, things were falling apart. Endless touring, heavy substance abuse, and growing tension between band members pushed everything to the edge. Ozzy became increasingly unreliable, and the chemistry that once defined them began to collapse. Then in 1979, everything changed. Ozzy was fired from the band he helped build. Many believed it would be the end of his career. Instead, it marked the beginning of a rivalry that would reshape heavy metal. Black Sabbath moved forward with a new voice, Ronnie James Dio. Together, they released Heaven and Hell.
The devil is never a maker.
Introducing a more epic, polished, and powerful direction. Meanwhile, Ozzy launched his solo career. With the help of guitar prodigy Randy Rhoads, he released Blizzard of Oz, proving he was more than just a frontman. He was a force of his own. Two different paths born from the same roots. This wasn't just a clash of egos, it was an evolution of sound. Black Sabbath reinvented themselves, while Ozzy set a new standard for solo metal artists. Sometimes breaking apart doesn't end the story. It creates two legends. At number 7, Fleetwood Mac, Everyone versus Everyone. This isn't just a rivalry. It's a full-blown emotional war. Welcome to Fleetwood Mac, where everyone was fighting everyone. In the mid-1970s, Fleetwood Mac was on top of the world, with a lineup featuring Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, Christine McVie, John McVie, and Mick Fleetwood. They had the talent, the fame, and the momentum. But behind the scenes, everything was falling apart. Romantic relationships inside the band were collapsing one by one. Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham broke up. Christine and John McVie divorced. Even Mick Fleetwood was going through his own personal turmoil. And the worst part? They didn't stop working. Instead, they turned their pain into music. The result was Rumors, one of the greatest albums of all time. Songs weren't just songs. They were messages, accusations, confessions, emotional attacks. Go your own way, was Lindsey calling out Stevie. Dreams was Stevie's response. The chain captured the tension that somehow still held them together. Every track felt personal, because it was. Recording the album was chaotic, fueled by heartbreak, arguments, and yes, a lot of drugs, but somehow that chaos created magic. Rumors didn't just succeed, it exploded. It became one of the best-selling albums in history and defined an era of rock music. This rivalry wasn't about bands competing. It was about people breaking and still choosing to create together, because sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the messiest emotions. At number 7, Fleetwood Mac proved one thing. You don't need enemies when your bandmates are enough. At number 6, Nirvana versus Guns N' Roses. This rivalry wasn't just about two bands, it was a clash of entire cultures. On one side, Nirvana, on the other, Guns N' Roses. By the early 1990s, Guns N' Roses ruled rock, with massive stadium tours, explosive performances, and the larger-than-life presence of Axl Rose. They represented everything rock had become. Loud, flashy, and unapologetically excessive. Then came Nirvana. Led by Kurt Cobain, Nirvana brought something completely different. Raw emotion, stripped-down sound, and a rejection of rock star excess. Their breakthrough album, Nevermind, didn't just succeed, it changed the direction of music. Suddenly, grunge replaced glam, and that's where the tension began. Kurt Cobain openly criticized Guns N' Roses, calling out what he saw as sexism and the toxic culture surrounding their image. Axl Rose didn't take it lightly. The conflict escalated through interviews, public statements, and even backstage confrontations. At one point, Axl challenged Nirvana to tour together. Kurt refused, mocking the idea and everything Guns N' Roses stood for. This wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. Guns N' Roses represented the old guard of rock, excess, fame, and spectacle. Nirvana represented a new wave, authenticity, vulnerability, and rebellion against that very image. The rivalry marked a turning point. As Nirvana rose, the dominance of glam metal faded. The entire industry shifted toward a more raw and honest sound. In the end, this wasn't about who won. It was about change. At number 6, Nirvana versus Guns N' Roses proved one thing. Sometimes a rivalry doesn't just define artists, it defines an era. At number 5, Van Halen versus David Lee Roth. This rivalry is all about ego, style, and one massive question. What happens when the frontman becomes bigger than the band? This is Van Halen versus their larger-than-life singer, David Lee Roth. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Van Halen was unstoppable. Powered by the revolutionary guitar work of Eddie Van Halen and the wild, charismatic energy of David Lee Roth, the band became one of the biggest names in rock. But behind the scenes, tension was building. Roth wanted more spotlight, more control, and a more glamorous direction. Meanwhile, Eddie was focused on musicianship, experimentation, and pushing the band's sound forward. Two visions, completely different. By 1985, it finally exploded. David Lee Roth left the band to pursue a solo career, confident he could outshine Van Halen on his own. And for a moment, it looked like he might. His solo work was flashy, fun, and full of personality, exactly what fans expected. But Van Halen didn't collapse. Instead, they brought in a new frontman, Sammy Hagar. everything changed. With Hagar, the band shifted toward a more polished, radio-friendly sound. And it worked. Albums like 5150 proved that Van Halen could evolve and succeed without Roth. Suddenly, fans were divided. Team Roth, raw energy, attitude, and classic Van Halen. Team Hagar, musical growth, bigger sound, and mainstream success. This wasn't just a breakup, it was a battle of identity. And to this day, the debate continues. Which version of Van Halen was better? At number 5, this rivalry proved one thing. Sometimes losing your frontman doesn't end the band. It creates a whole new one. At number 4, Metallica versus Megadeth. This isn't just a rivalry, it's personal. A story of rejection, revenge, and redemption. This is Metallica versus Megadeth. And it all begins with one man, Dave Mustaine. In the early 1980s, Mustaine was the lead guitarist of Metallica, but due to heavy drinking, aggressive behavior, and internal conflict, he was suddenly kicked out of the band just as they were on the verge of success. He didn't leave quietly. He left angry. On the long trip back home, Mustaine made a promise to form a band that would be faster, heavier, and better than Metallica. That promise became Megadeth. And just like that, the rivalry was born. Metallica exploded into global fame with albums like Master of Puppets, becoming the face of thrash metal. Meanwhile, Megadeth carved their own path, known for technical precision, complex riffs, and a more aggressive edge. This wasn't just about music. It was about proving a point. Mustaine constantly compared himself to Metallica, driven by the belief that he deserved to be part of their success. Metallica, on the other hand, rarely responded directly, making the tension even stronger. Fans were divided. Metallica, bigger, more iconic. Megadeth, more technical, more intense. For decades, the rivalry played out through interviews, subtle jabs, and competing albums. But time has a way of changing things. In 2010, they finally shared the same stage as part of the Big Four, former rivals, standing side by side. At number 4, this rivalry proves one thing. Sometimes rejection doesn't destroy you. It defines you. At number 3, Pink Floyd, Roger Waters versus David Gilmour. This isn't just a rivalry. It's a battle for the soul of a band. This is Pink Floyd divided between two creative forces, Roger Waters and David Gilmour. In the 1970s, Pink Floyd became one of the most influential bands in history. Albums like The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall redefined what rock music could be: deep, conceptual, and emotionally powerful. At the center of it all was Roger Waters, the band's primary songwriter and conceptual mind. But as his control grew stronger, so did the tension. David Gilmour, the band's guitarist and sonic architect, had a different vision, more focused on melody, atmosphere, and musical balance. Two geniuses, two directions. By the early 1980s, the band was breaking apart. Waters began to see Pink Floyd as his personal project. In 1985, he officially left the band, believing that Pink Floyd couldn't continue without him. But he was wrong. David Gilmour carried the band forward, releasing new music and continuing under the Pink Floyd name. What followed was not just a creative split, but a legal battle over who truly owned the identity of the band. It became one of the most famous lawsuits in rock history. Fans were divided. Waters, the visionary, the storyteller. Gilmour, the sound, the emotion, the soul. For years, the feud seemed permanent. Until 2005, at Live 8, the classic lineup reunited on stage for the first time in decades. For one moment, the rivalry disappeared and the music spoke again. At number 3, this rivalry proves one thing. Even the greatest bands can't escape division, but their legacy can survive it. At number 2, Noel Gallagher versus Liam Gallagher, Oasis. This isn't just a rivalry, it's brother versus brother. This is Oasis torn apart by the explosive relationship between Noel Gallagher and Liam Gallagher. In the mid-1990s, Oasis became the voice of a generation. With anthems like Wonderwall and Don't Look Back in Anger, they defined the Britpop era and stood at the center of British music culture. But behind the success, chaos. Noel was the mastermind, the songwriter, the planner, the one shaping the band's sound. Liam was the frontman, raw, unpredictable, and full of attitude. Together, they were unstoppable and completely incompatible. Their relationship was filled with constant arguments, insults, and even physical fights. Concerts were canceled. Interviews turned into public arguments. Backstage? Even worse. At times, they refused to be in the same room. Yet somehow, the music kept coming. Albums like What's the Story, Morning Glory became massive global successes. The tension didn't destroy the band, it fueled it. But no rivalry lasts forever without consequences. In 2009, everything finally collapsed. After another heated argument backstage in Paris, Noel walked away for good. Oasis was over. Just like that. Fans were left with one question. What could they have achieved if they stayed together? Even after the breakup, the feud never truly ended. Interviews, social media jabs, and public insults kept the rivalry alive for years. At number 2, this isn't just a band conflict. It's one of the most iconic sibling rivalries in music history. Because sometimes the greatest chemistry comes with the greatest conflict. At number 1, the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. This is the rivalry that defined an entire era. Not just band versus band, but image, attitude, and identity. This is the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. In the 1960s, both bands rose to global fame, but they couldn't have been more different. The Beatles were clean-cut, charming, and universally loved. They represented melody, innovation, and a new wave of pop rock that changed everything. The Rolling Stones? The complete opposite. Raw, rebellious, and dangerous. Led by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, they embraced a darker, blues-driven sound and a bad boy image that shocked audiences. Media fueled the rivalry. Beatles versus Stones. Good boys versus bad boys. Fans picked sides. But here's the twist. Behind the scenes, it wasn't pure hatred. In fact, early in their careers, John Lennon and Paul McCartney even helped the Rolling Stones by giving them a song, I Wanna Be Your Man. Still, the competition was real. Each band pushed the other to evolve. As the Beatles experimented with studio innovation and concept albums, the Rolling Stones responded with grittier, more aggressive records. They didn't just compete, they elevated each other. This rivalry helped shape modern rock music as we know it. 2 different styles, 2 different identities, 1 shared impact. And decades later, the question still remains. Who was better? At number 1, this rivalry proves one thing. Sometimes the greatest competition doesn't destroy, it creates legends.